My machine? Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So, number 4 in Bad Catholic Guide to the Faith. We'll go ahead and begin with the prayer to Mary and then get right into it. So, if you'll join me in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, and Son, and the Holy Ghost. Yes, so, as completely just and right of God to do, it's coming up on spring break, so I have a really bad cold. So forgive me if I'm hard to hear. And, we have 6 lectures in this, but you notice that there are 7 deadly sins. So that means that we will pair some out together. I think that the rest of the year will go lust when we get back from spring break. We're doing greed beforehand. Somehow that book-ending spring break with those seems appropriate, I don't know. And then the last one we'll deal with vainglory and envy together. So today, I gave it away, the vice cover is greed. And the verb here opposed to it is, he says generosity. To avoid confusion, but with Aristotle it's actually liberality, but we've since sort of used that word to be only one sort of political
Gotta be careful with that word.
Yeah, so, and then neurosis. I actually seen him use this differently as well, but in the book he's calling it prodigality. Well, he talks about that today as well. One of the things, I don't know if any of you've noticed, but Zmirak, before he writes the books, he's wrote quite a few, many different places, and so he's a brilliant man. He writes these essays, and then he gets money, publishing them, and then he makes a book, and he gets to make money about them again. So getting to look at both, because I learned of this book because I sort of read it as he was making it, and to publish notes, I actually will look at the book and then look at what's different from what he said beforehand, and so it's always interesting. So for instance, he's making a point at one point about some people think that before the fall, animals didn't eat each other, which, I think it's ridiculous, but he says some people believe that, and on the web version he says it would be like a T-Rex eating celery. But in the book, he changed it to a velociraptor eating a carrot. I don't know why that needed to change, but he did. There's little things like that. But then there's bigger things like, so greed, also classically called avarice. And so on the web, when he first made it, it's avarice, and he changed it to greed. And, I don't know why necessarily all that stuff works out that way. But it made me think with greed, greed is so central to what we often do that there's loads of words for it. And that's what I was, the belabor point was, is that it might not matter very much to make a metaphor whether it's a T-Rex and celery or velociraptor with carrots, just like it doesn't matter really if you want to talk about greed, or if you want to talk about avarice, or if you want to talk about generosity and liberality. We say you got to be careful with the word liberality, but you got to be just as careful with the word generosity and what generous means. Greed seems very simple. Don't be greedy. Don't want too much than you need. Part of the thing with the 7 deadly sins and how people talk about it, now that we've been through a few, is it starts getting to be, well, how's greed any different than temperance, for instance? Temperance is not taking too much of what you need. So what is greed? What's the difference? And in other classes, one that is taught today, talking about Aristotle makes a clear difference between generosity and being temperate. Now, of course, it's going to be obvious that if you're temperate, you are much more likely equipped to be generous as well. You won't worry about taking too much in. You know, and if you're a non-temperate person and you need to spend your money on just one more, fifth of whiskey because you can't hold it yourself, you're not going to have near the money, to donate to your local soup kitchen or what it may be. But we have to start thinking about how virtue, there's all these debates that we start to have, like, can you have one and not any of the others? It sure seems like we have people we can think of who are plenty brave, but once they get back from the front, they may show themselves to be a bit intemperate, and that warfare might cause them to act a certain way, even though they were plenty courageous in warfare. So we have personal experience with the sort of differences that go on between the virtues, but on the other hand, we start to see how the virtues all start to stack together. And a lot of times in moral quandaries, people think about, well, is morality more this individual thing or is it more this communal thing? Should we look first to how we care towards others before we, so to speak, look at ourselves? And you'll hear people say straight out, I'm not worried as much about my, addiction to A, B, or C because I'm not a greedy SOB and I'm helping people. And someone who's worked at a homeless shelter, the good people that helped every day with people who literally would have starved to death sometimes if they had not worked at the homeless shelter, were exceedingly vicious in other parts of their life. And so for them, I'm not going to be caught up with myself. I'm going to worry about these other people, and this rectifies all sorts of problems I've done. But to think about greed right after talking about temperance makes us see how these things cannot profitably be separated. There's no real way, not that you can't be greedy but relatively temperate, or not that you can't be intemperate and then mostly be generous. The full functioning and the full view of the moral life sees a commonwealth as the first way we understand how human beings function. And it's not that we ignore the individual, but that the individual himself or herself is a commonwealth of various parts. We can't ever get down to the atomistic aspect of the moral life, if you will. When you get to thinking about yourself, you are a commonwealth of body and soul. If you ignore bodily virtues, your spirit suffers. And if you ignore spiritual virtues, your body will suffer, and vice versa. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that in considering the moral life, it is ridiculous to consider virtues of the individual above or below the ones that affect everyone else. So then again, it makes good sense to talk about temperance in the way that we use things so that we don't use them excessively or deficiently. Then we immediately turn to greed, which is the sort of outward movement. Temperance is the intake, if you will, and greed is the outtake, the output. If I'm temperate with myself, I use things properly in context to me. If I am generous, I use them properly towards other people. And so, properly to other people takes a bit of phronesis, of practical wisdom. We can talk all we want about the general outline of ethics, but if anybody looks at Aristotle very closely, and Thomas and the people who follow Aristotle after him, Aristotle constantly warns that it only makes sense to expect the degree of specificness out of a science or a field that the field warrants. I know that I've said this again and again, but it's something very important to remember. He says, think about right angles. For a geometer, the right angle must be perfect, or the geometric proofs will not stand. But for a carpenter, it would be ridiculous to spend weeks on end trying to make one wall a perfect right angle, because it cannot happen and it will not stay. And in the ethical life, we have the same dilemma. It's easy for people to cast the name of greedy on plenty of people. Maybe easier than any other. You know, we're going to call someone lustful. We better be certain to point to some behavior that looks like lust, or the same thing with prudishness. Anger is another one where, you know, we want to see people act angry, but greed is relative, but doesn't mean that it's relativistic. And greed for one person is easily generosity in another. Someone who lives on their own has a different measure between whether they are greedy, generous, or prodigal than compared to someone who has a family or someone who rules over many people. And in I say all this thinking that in the news, Americans are called greedy and love calling each other greedy, and have tried to abuse the word so much that it means nothing. So we have to really try to be specific about what turns out to be greed. And I think it actually makes sense that if you had the book that we've mostly been using, the 7 Deadly Sins book, the greed book, it's frankly Smirac's. The greed chapter is the most sprawling. He's kind of all over the place. There's a lot to say, and it's hard to get uniform. So although I want to bring up what I think are some really good insights by Smirach, I actually think it's going to take us a little bit of pondering ourselves. What's the best way to consider how I can be a generous person? He's joked around before. This is not just a joke that Smirach has came up with, but many people will say that, oh, the Republicans, they're the party of greed, and the Democrats are the party of envy. And you've heard this. I'm sure if you haven't heard it, you'll catch it sometime in the political column. And so Smirach says, well, I'm going to put myself to the test and see if this really works out. And he says, questions like this are never so simple. It's not like party affiliation is just choosing which vice you would like to enact in your life. So he says, imagine a Wall Street banker who offers reckless mortgages might be one of those men who love too much nice food, too much vacation time, too many antique pistols, sniffers of brandy, hand-rolled cigars. These things are all quite innocent in themselves and in proper doses. Smirach puts, they add the spice to life, antique pistols. Yeah. On the other hand, a banksta, which I guess is Smirach's way of calling a banker who's like a gangsta. Anyway, a banksta might be driven by competition, by resentment at the sight of his classmates from Wharton living just a little bit happier. That kind of man could watch his own house of cards collapse and still be happy when he sees the for sale signs on his classmates' condos and watches his boss's Lamborghini get towed by the repo man. Republican envy. So it's not just, you're working on N Street, you're greedy. Maybe you just like destroying other people. Conversely, the slacker who votes to redistribute the wealth might not be envious at all. Let's say he's just eager to get a government check or have his liposuction paid for by the state. But he doesn't daydream about higher IRS bills for his neighbor or inheritance taxes seizing other people's ancestral homes. He just doesn't give too much thought about it. He just needs the money. Democratic greed. He's joking around. So he says politics doesn't help very much when you think about greed. And it's funny, of course, because that's the word we want to throw out at the beginning. Politics is greed and pork barrels and this, that, or the other. And as Smirach puts it, our country is blessed with just 2 competitive parties, but we've got 7 deadly sins, so there's plenty to go around equally. We don't have to act like one has put a monopoly on any particular vice. So what greed is all about is the happy, carefree feeling of limitless life and the goods of life. It's not just involved. It's not so much enjoying one thing to an excess or deficiency, but the want of the situation of this endlessly being available. And like I said, this is a virtue and a vice that immediately invokes our relations with other people. So if the gumbo pot is full, the keg is overflowing. Victorian homes are sprouting fully decorated from the ground at only 3% down payment, with no down payment, then all the world is right. And that's what we want. So he says this is the same thing that he lived in New York during the internet boom, and people were accepting salary options in stock instead of actual money issued. And he says this idea that we'll just get the stock rights and then retire at 30, instead of seeing the market as an investment, it's the same sort of deal. How can we make sure that that everything is coming up at full tilt, and not what's the best way to conserve the goods that we have? What he says is essentially greed comes from a very natural place. And it's that Adam and Eve before the fall were a creature made to enjoy the plenitude of God. And that this is a spiritual and physical reality for us. Why are we greedy by nature? Well, because at nature it's not that we're vicious. Of course, any vice is something we learn secondarily. All habits are second natures, as Aristotle says. So it's not that kids are born greedy, but they are born geared towards the plenitude God made human beings for. Human beings were born gardeners. That's why we were born into the Garden of Eden, to tend its fruits and to enjoy them. We were born to enjoy the goodness of God, both spiritually and physically. And greed is asking for too much of the goodness we were freely given, and then not living with the consequences of not living in this appropriate way. So greed is not some special province of people who live well, of Americans, of men versus women. A political party, it's actually a side that points directly to the goodness God created us in. And yet again, we always talk about with these vices, there's some foundation within humanity that makes us so capable of going towards the vice. So capable of going towards the vice. And greed is actually like a good child that expects from a loving parent that it will get whatever it needs. And then the next thing that the child thinks is that it would get whatever it wants. It conflates the two. And so a child who's young and even below the age of reason, where we don't think they're culpable of their sins, has every right to think that mom and dad will bring them dinner when they're hungry, but then they equate that with mom and dad will get any toy that I want to, because every time I've pointed at something so far, I've got it, because my parents love me. That's a good parent, as Christ says, you don't give your kids snakes when they ask for food. If you ever see that happening, it's actually time to call the child services. Giving snakes to hungry kids, it's bad parenting. We can all agree on that, I think. Maybe if the snake's cooked. At any rate, the point being, humans had a good parent, and they conflated wants and needs, and when they messed up and had to live with the consequence of their action, this capacity still stays with us, and actually, if done correctly, drives us towards heaven. Part and parcel of the problem with greed is trying to satiate the insatiable in us with things that cannot ever fill the hole. And so, if we can only move greed towards, if you will, to be sort of oxymoronic, the greed of the grace of God, you can never be too greedy for more grace, right? You can never be more greedy for more of God's will. But based within us is this very simple thing. We have a loving Father. We have a resplendent world that God gave us. But since the fall, we must realize the reality of scarcity. We must not choke ourselves on the nostalgia for Eden. And that starts to be the root of where greed comes from. We do not deserve, or it's not even deserve, we cannot in our current state live appreciatively of the Eden that we've left behind. All greed is a nostalgia for this innocence that we have fallen away from. It's no surprise, Mirak points out, that only very dorky people who love math like economics. The science of scarcity is not a fun-loving science. You don't get to learn neat tricks. You get to learn, oh crap, there's only so much to go around. How do we rightfully do that? And then when you are an economist and you try to make simple solutions like, well, split it equally, you soon see how foolish that would be. Or, oh, give it to the people who need it most. And you see how foolish that is, because then certain people don't want to help out. We go, well, what if we have to create actual wealth out of the scarcity we have? And then you go, well, fine, we'll give it to everybody who tries hardest. And then you just see the multitude of problems. Economics, there's no end to economics like there is in other sciences. You think, I'm going to cure cancer. Who knows if we ever will? But you have this idea in mind, right? Well, we've cured polio. We found the medicine. We give people the medicine. They don't get polio. And we go, yes, we're all working towards that. Economics, until the second coming, there's no magic cure. When Jesus says the poor will always be with us, there's always been this idea about figuring out who the poor are. But of course he meant all of us. We who cannot ever find a sustainability that will always last. All things are degrading. All things are falling apart, only to be leading towards the greater reconciliation, recapitulation that God is working throughout human history. But economics, there's not a lot of fun to it. There's some neat ingenuity that we might be able to have. We might be able to point out the neat things people do. But the Bible tells us that scarcity is as unnatural to us as death. And people want to say death is part of nature. You have to learn death is part of life. But the Christian story wants to say no, it was something added to life because of sin, because of what we could not accept in our uneducated state, if you will, that led us astray. Death is added just like scarcity. Because of Christ, even death defeats death. And because of Christ, suffering can defeat suffering. And because of Christ, scarcity can defeat scarcity. But anybody who just loves scarcity or death or suffering should not be your friend. If that's one of, on their Facebook interests, scarcity, suffering, death, unfriend them and don't hang out with them. That's easy advice to give. But regardless of how literally we take things like, this is Mirag, details like Adam's rib, there are solid facts conveyed in Genesis which the church will not ever interpret away. And one of this is, barring the whole apple scandal, man was meant to live forever with an unlimited supply of whatever he needed. Mirag says, I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of this, since we were also supposed to breed, but a God who's perfectly fine with overflowing grace could obviously work it out. Medieval theologians who spent their time sweating such details, says Mirag, had another answer. They pointed to the fate of Virgin Mary, who, ever since the early church, had been famous for ending her time on earth by being assumed, raising to heaven body and soul. And then he makes the pun, this is a pretty big assumption on their part. Booze, Mirag. But the idea is, we could have that radical trust in God that we didn't have to worry about it. But post the fall, we literally have to think about stuff like, if we're all doing good enough that we can have multiple kids and not worry about things immediately like polio, what does that mean that we have to do with the resources we have? And we have to make decisions about food, shelter, how we live, etc. So although we are designed to crave endless life and limitless wealth, let's be honest, heaven is endless life and limitless wealth, the real wealth, the everlasting wealth, the wealth that will not go away. Praise the Lord that heaven will not be rationed. It's like, welcome to heaven, here's A rations. You get to eat a little each. No, we don't have to worry about carbon footprints or anything like this. But we are born into a world formed of sharp edges, raging bulls, and grizzly bears, as he says. Now, he says it's not quite some zero sum. There are worlds that work better than others, system that works better than others. His joke is see which countries have people going into them and which ones having people leave. There's not a strictly limited pie, which the nice men from the government ought to slice for us. We also don't all deserve the same. We don't have to come up with these things. Fashion models who brighten our lives by simply existing in front of a camera deserve elaborate French meals, he says, but he's joking around here. But there are limits, so many limits to the wealth each of us can learn. When we crave much more than that, sometimes we steal. If we lack the enterprise for that, we sulk or simply beg. On a small scale, guilty works pretty well. Able-bodied panhandlers often make more money than the workers whom they harass. But begging on a huge scale relies much more on threats. For instance, give us $700 billion or we'll be back in the Great Depression. So he has modern concerns in mind. So the economy and how we think of it has turned into the science of scarcity. It's very telling to think, though, where the word economy comes from in the West. So, economy comes from two Greek words. Oikos and nomos, meaning household, and law, the law of the household. It makes sense where economy, the word, as the sort of order of house, the ordered house, comes into what we use as the economy in general. So the world's household, if you will. But this makes sense in the ancient times. The economic unit was the household, and they don't just mean the nuclear family and how they live together. They talk about the entirety of a person who owns enough land for people to produce what they can make and eat and sell. This was the divine economy. To rule your household was to rule your economy. And actually, the name that theologians give to God working out salvation is the divine economy, the divine oikonomos, the God managing his household and who will belong to his church. So there's two at the simultaneous times, the economy of heaven, which does not lack in scarcity at all. The overflowing of God's grace and how he manages it. And then there's the economy that we have on earth that must deal with scarcity. And this is where you start getting all of the famous considerations of the two things at once. So Augustine in the City of God, he talks about the city of God, the city of man, and the Christians who have their feet in both. How is it that the people of mercy should willingly accept things like being a judge, where you might have to decide to put someone on death knowing that in this life we do not have full, complete, absolute knowledge about particulars. And Augustine says, if I can paraphrase him very crudely, that what we can do to maintain order in this life will reflect the unbreakable order of the heavenly kingdom, that this sort of serves as the bridge between the people who only know the love of man and that we are trying to draw towards the love of God. When it comes to our ability to match up things that seem so severely different, the heavenly economy with the earthly one, the one that has to consider scarcity and the one that has no scarcity at all, there's still the idea working simultaneously that nature perfects grace, it does not destroy it. And that starts to be the real difficulty if you want to look at the explosion of the economy and what it's become. If you want to get into very technical, theological underpinnings of the modern economy, read Max Weber and what he says about Calvinism and the fact that your works on earth mean nothing either way. If you're predestined, what does it matter? So you might as well earn some change while you're here, right? What's the big deal? Okay. Now, if the human economy And the divine economy, though seemingly so different and match up in some way, we have to figure out that indeed that grace perfects nature, because remember, God creates nature, but that grace never undercuts nature. That the nature we have is not destroyed, but redeemed. Not destroyed, but brought towards the gracious thing. So it's true that mercy surpasses justice, but does not undercut it. Mercy surpasses justice, but that does not undercut it. We cannot plead mercy to let criminals run free. That would be ridiculous. That would be destroying the natural justice necessary for an ordered society. So although we should be merciful to criminals as much as we can, that in no way would mean that we should not lock them up and deny them of particular rights that we allow other people. For instance, walking out in the sunlight with a gun in their hand. We say, no, for at least some period of time, you will be behind these bars in the hopes that justice will be done. And since we're merciful, by the way, we won't cut off your right hand because you stole. We hope 6 months in the pen might jog your brain a bit. Same thing with economics. We need to be as generous. See, I just screwed up. Generosity is the goal. So you think about the prodigal son, where they get the idea of prodigality. It's true. As much as possible, we should strive to be like the prodigal father who willingly gives to the undeserving, but only if it doesn't undercut justice to the second brother. And if you'll notice about the story of the prodigal son, when the brother complains, the dad doesn't go, well, you're the good son, so forget you, loser, or go sweep. This isn't like the story of Cinderella, right? And he's chose one son and not the other. I'm going to blank now since I brought it up, but it's something to the effect of, you could have the fattened lamb any time you're here. But he was lost and now he's found. We can slaughter the fattened lamb for the people who were lost and now found, but only as long as the second brother is not starving. And of course in this, the second brother was not. We can ask, we can talk about it, we can make public decisions about foregoing extravagances for the sake of other people, but we cannot act like being super generous or mercifully generous ever undercuts the generosity we must do for the people that are owed it. Now this, when you think about it in terms of greed, excuse me, this might all seem to dissipate and go away. When we think about what greedy people do and what they're trying to pull off, after the big near apology that I just made for greed, it might seem like, well, Bo, they're just acting like you said, by nature. They want more stuff because they're used to more stuff. But yet again, to bring up Aristotle will talk about virtues, and he says there's 3 things that occur in the soul, and virtue can only be one of them. Feelings or passions is the better word. We have passions of the soul, we have capacities of the soul, and we have states of the soul. And he said the passion of the souls are the things, so the word passion, we usually think about it really ridiculously. When we say someone's passionate, we mean they're like, I don't know, over bubbly or romantic. I don't know what we mean. But the idea of the word passion, of course, has the root of being passive, actually. And what it means is the passions are the things that act on us and in which we are passive towards. So emotions follow this, right? When you're angry, you are angry whether you want to be or not. You've said this before to your friend. I can't control it. I'm just mad at you right now. Desires are like this as well. I can't help it. I'm just hungry. If only it were so easy as, stomach, you're not hungry right now. Blip. Then no one would look like me. We just turn it off. That doesn't happen. all these with anything that arises of passion. He says, now look, virtue has to be in our command because we say virtue is praiseworthy and vice blameworthy. Therefore, passion cannot be the source of virtue. So then he moves on to capacity. And he says, people have different capacities for the feelings they have. Everybody gets angry. Bonners are really good at it, is the idea, right? So like, some people have very non-irascible souls. Like, you ever met those people who are like, I'm very mad at you right now. Like, oh, I'm sorry. Or the people who don't laugh, they say that's funny. Zmirek has a whole book somewhere where he talks about, he had a girlfriend that he had to break up with because she was from Iowa. He thought Iowa had something to do with it. And he says, the reason I had to break up is because she wouldn't laugh. She would just say, that's funny. He's like, as a New Yorker, it wouldn't work out. Anyway, but so there's people who, we all have passions, but some of us have higher capacities for others. So, Bonners reach insane rage levels very easy. It's just part of the Bonner heritage. While other people have no capacity for joy, for instance. And we feel bad for them. But he says there it's the same thing. It can't be virtue in the capacities, Aristotle says, because it's not about how high or low you feel the passion. It's what you do with it. And so this is what he means by a state of our soul. You can be angry or not. It's how you react to the anger. You can be angry and feel it very vehemently, but as long as you don't act on it, you're praiseworthy. I mean, if the anger's wrong. Aristotle will talk about that there's good anger too. But let's just imagine that, like, anger that's disproportionate, right? You can feel it very intensely, but if you don't act on it, you're praiseworthy. But the person who actually has, no capacity for anger, and they only get a little bit angry, but if they act on it, they're at fault. And so greed starts coming in to this sort of consideration. It's true, I've just said that it's our longing for what we were born as in the garden, but there starts to be this misunderstanding about how to properly deal with those things that arise in us naturally. This inability to feel the passions that come through us through capacities in the certain type of way. And so human beings get very industrious in trying to come up with ways to circumvent this reality of scarcity. Instead of being reasonable, thinking about it in the long term, thinking about how what we do with our bodies can match up better with our souls, how it is that our economy of things match the economy of God, how is it that we make sure to be industrious enough to have plenty so that we can feed those in justice who we must feed, but have a little extra left over for those who are prodigal sons. Instead of thinking and using our rationality towards that, we get to scheming. And that's where greed comes in. It's the sort of, you must have friends that are schemers. And it's always these sort of, greedy people always have shortcuts in mind, is my point, right? Like, I guess you could be greedy and be very industrious and work hard, but that seems to miss the whole point of greed, right? Like, if you worked your whole life to get a lot of money and, like, you're bent over and you hurt and ache and you can't enjoy the greed, then it seems beside the point. No, you want to scheme it, right? You want to pick up the coolest new stock so that you can sell it at that magic moment right before it nosedives, and then you can live in a hot tub until you drown in it from wine and whiskey. I mean, so scheming, right? That's what, we put all this wonderful stuff that God has given us, and then we get to scheming instead of getting to work. And so Smirek, because his life is like this, he remembers before the dot-com bubble, before the housing bubble, he remembers the ostrich bubble of Louisiana in the 1990s, because that's how he lived his life. There were all these farmers in Louisiana that were getting destroyed by government subsidies elsewhere. And so they couldn't make enough money being dairy farmers anymore. So what they figured out is if you buy emus and ostriches and other rare birds at the time, and I don't know about you, in the 1990s, like now you can buy any weird meat somewhere, right? You go to Wichita, there's something. You can buy, you know, zucchinis they grow on Mars and weird crap like this. But in the 90s, hell, in Oklahoma, I don't know if there was anything but hamburger and chicken and pork. I think that was it, you know. So these Louisiana farmers were like, we'll buy gourmet meat. Because people are talking about like emu and ostriches and their eggs being the next big thing. And so what happened was someone figured out, some special breeder decided that they could convince these farmers to buy breeder pairs at $30,000 each. And they said, look, these birds are worth $30,000 each. So if you just have 5 of them, $150,000, you sell it to the next guy. But what they meant was, you sell it to the next chump who doesn't realize that these birds are worthless until you start killing them to eat them. But do you realize to make it work, like an ostrich, I don't even know, but let's just say an ostrich is 50 pounds. To recoup your money on a $15,000 bird, how much do you have to sell a pound hamburger of ostrich for? Math people looking at you. Yeah, we don't want to know, like, this is like a thousands of dollar hamburger to eat, which makes absolutely no sense at all. So what happened was, some dude came up with this brilliant pyramid scheme that everybody would be doing fine until no one was doing fine, because then you couldn't sell these birds. And so then he went back and he has all these things about, like, they had these great ostrich feasts because they had to get rid of these stupid birds. So they ate ostrich for like a month, and the emus were even worse. You couldn't even really cook their meat. It burnt too fast, so they just let them fly away. It was all very sad, he said. So he said what probably happened is like half of the people ended up working at Wendy's asking, would you like ostrich with that? This is the type of stuff that people use to ruin the same pursuit that their fellow man must have. And this Mirag says he thought of this as he was using his 401k to clean up his beagle's poop. So, it's around the same sort of time. But greed just doesn't stop, of course, at merely acquiring money. Greed is this sort of, like I said, a nostalgia that the more and more it gets out of hand, the more and more it just becomes juvenile will to power. So that's the problem with greed, right? I mean, as someone who, we grew up fine, but, I don't think anybody in our family has ever, like, made Wall Street type, money. I just never understood why. I mean, sloth is a bigger deal for Oklahomans, because you get enough money, you're like, I'll never work again. And what that is really low. But these people who just want to keep acquiring money, you always go, why keep acquiring, right? Isn't $1 billion enough? Couldn't you just eat McDonald's every day until your life, that's $1 hamburger. You have to live 1 billion days. But greed, it's like it's always wanting more because of this expectation that it could be limitless. And you get this sort of idea that the problem with greed is you would get to the limitless of heaven and not be satisfied with it. And greed at its worst form is not just having a lot of stuff, but at some point having stuff isn't enough. And so you have to go after the bigger game, if you will. And you'll notice this, right? Like when you're rich enough, hunting like deer isn't enough, so you have to go shoot a giraffe. And they have like a giraffe head in their building. And then, I don't know, you've heard this trope before, like this happens again and again, that rich people eventually, hunt people. And you go, oh, this is just a silly sort of tale until you look at people like, who's Mirac points out, Mao Zedong, which he says, one way to explain Mao is he just wanted bigger and bigger game. It wasn't enough to work up the ranks of the Communist Party and like he points out, Mao was not some sort of worker bee that just worked really hard. You can read from his diaries. He wanted to avoid work. He wanted to be powerful. And the way he sort of thought that this would happen is to create mayhem. So, really chilling quotes from Mao's diary are things like this. The self, I, above everything else. I do not agree with the view that to be moral, the motive of one's actions has to be benefiting others. Morality does not have to be defined in relation to others. People like me want to satisfy our hearts to the full, and in doing so, we automatically have the most valuable moral codes. Of course, there are people and objects in the world, but they are all there only for me. Mao shunned all constraints of responsibility and duty. People like me only have a duty to ourselves. We have no duty to other people. Mao says other crazy stuff like, all our actions are driven by impulse, and the conscience that is wise goes along with this in every instance. Sometimes conscience restrains impulses, such as overeating or overindulgence in sex, but conscience is only there to restrain, not to oppose, and the restraint is there for better completion of the impulse. And so you go, okay, well this sounds like most what everybody else in the 60s was thinking of. It's just Mao was pulling it off at such a bigger clip. And if Zmirak says what you start to read with someone like Zmirak, I call Zmirak now, with Mao, is Mao just seemed to be a greater capacity for all of this. It's like he never decided to stop. He was just more forthright with this impulse of people who keep letting greed overcome them. He says, Mao is just like Hugh Hefner or anybody who tries to impose their will on all these other people, but at some point, sexual exploitation wasn't enough. At some point, being honored by everyone wasn't enough. At some point, being on the top of the food chain for everything wasn't enough. And so Mao literally talks about how mayhem was necessary for China. He tells his underlings that Marxism, its main principle is cruelty, about destroying the earth and rebuilding it. And pretty soon, greed leads to the one thing that we know we can't have, but we can try to imitate, and that is the creative power of God. But the only way that we ultimately create like God is of two ways. Either doing His will, so having families, making children, or making spiritual children as religious. Art has this aspect as well. Or we create through destruction, which is, of course, this sort of anti-creation, this undoing, this disruption of the normal way. And so greed is not simply just attaining more money than everyone else. Greed is literally trying to get back to the Garden of Eden and then keep going back further and usurping from God what we think God maybe even owes us. The rest of what Zmirak starts to get at, I have to be honest, he doesn't really, he deals with prodigality in all sorts of different ways. He has this article that he put out that, what did he put it? It's called Being Baptized is Not an Economics Degree. And in it, he sort of points out, that Catholics, just any old Catholic, will talk about the church supporting the living wage, or decent conditions for the workers, opportunity for the poor, economic justice, rights for immigrants, health care, that there's all these easy, hot words that we throw out there and act like being Catholic is the simple way to explain the science of scarcity. And a lot of the time, what Catholics eventually get excoriated in the media is naming a sort of principle solves the issue of a very practical nature. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that generosity, what it has to mean, is a concern for individuals in particular situations. Yet again, this is Plato. To bring up Plato, The Republic of Plato, its whole point is to ask the question of what justice is. And I think I've told you this before, but all I ever do in my life is repeat stuff, so get used to it. Point of the Republic, what is justice? And within 5 pages, you get the answer. What is justice? Giving to each their due. The end. The book then goes on for hundreds of more pages. The question is why? Well, that's the right answer to justice, giving each its due. But what do we mean and how do we ground that very question consumes the whole rest of the book. The immediate answer to what do we mean when we say giving each its due, someone says, oh, well, that means helping your friends and harming your enemies. And we want to go, oh, wait, we don't mean give each his due like that. And so then the question comes up, well, what do you mean by give each his due? So, when we get to sort of, Zmirak has in mind Catholics, but this goes with all public discourse. When we start talking about economics especially, or anything that has to do with scarcity, if we want to say, well, people need a living wage, we need to worry about the poor, we need economic justice, we need this, that, or the other, the real question is, what do you mean by that, and how do we do it practically and now? Greed, all virtues are guided by prudence, but greed seems to be the one that is best seen as being tempered by prudence. When we get into actually temperance, like we said last time, there's a very habitual training about temperance. It's prudent, but I don't know, it's almost like rules of thumb more than anything else. It's true, I can't decide beforehand if you need to be temperate, how many drinks you can drink before you're a lush or a drunk. I don't know. Person to person, that's different. But there's a real way in which there's a sort of connatural feel to matters of temperance. I know how much temptation that I can face, so I need to make sure not to tempt myself and stay away from the near occasions of sin. Prudence governs the difference between greed, generosity, and prodigality, because when it comes to a world that has scarce system that we want to match as possible to an economics that is overflowing with goodness, matching particular means to ends is of prime importance. An economy often gets wrongly done when the scale of what economics has in mind is lost sight of. And so, I didn't take economics, so I'm not going to try to act like this is a division between micro and macroeconomics. But there's all sorts of generalizations that we can say that when we get down to the very particulars of the matter, wouldn't make sense depending on who we're talking about. What would it mean to be greedy as an American? That starts to be the question. If you compare a relatively well-off part of America with the absolute worst part economically of some country, it would be really easy to act like the solution is to chop out half of what you make and dump those resources immediately into whoever we're talking about. But there's so many considerations that we have to keep in mind. First of all, it is against the very dignity of the poor to act like how you solve their problems is dumping money straight on them, as if the problem has been that they somehow have not just thought of that solution of using their money rightly. This has come up actually, one of these Facebook memes you've seen, the Invisible Children group has been talking about Coney 2012. It's the guy who leads the Lord's Resistance Army. They're no longer in Uganda. I actually think they're in Congo now. And look, Coney's been doing his weird, crazy, horrible stuff for a long time, but there's this group that's very pushing for military force to be used. And one of the responses we see most to this whole phenomenon It's not Democrats or Republicans in America. It seems like people are relatively for intervening in this matter. But it's Ugandans who say, look, certainly we need help with certain things, but we're tired of the narrative of it being seen like we have no capacity to deal with our own problems at all. And charity cannot act like human beings are mere children, or that the only way to solve problems is simply to, like the mother bird regurgitating the food into the mouth of the poor. But on the same page, the strong are made strong by the will of God to help the weak. And this whole notion of how scarcity works would seem to benefit by, I guess what I'm trying to pull about by saying this economy of scale is to think about less what method I did to attain this money. Because when we think about methods, it's always, to me, just one step away from a scheme. What we need to be honest about is, with every good plan, much grace goes into all of it. And that is not to dissipate or look down upon or tell people not to work hard. But if people are truly humble and deciding about the prudent measures that they need to do, then when they look at the matters of how generous they're going to be or how much they're going to act in as far as saving money or investing it or doing things like this, we can never act like the economy is about anything but people sharing and living in and creating and contributing to a world that is scarce but also full of what John Zmirak much earlier said, the spice of life. Culture cannot be severed from the interaction between a person and the community. People who look only at individuals and individual virtues, to bring this back full circle, effectively treat human beings like mannequins, as if all there is the individual concern. But the same people who only consider social concerns are more than willing to trample over individual rights, to supposedly be generous when maybe this shows a greed of power, or at least a imprudent prodigality towards what other people have. And envious, of course, will come up with this as well. Zmirak brings this up by talking about 12-step programs and people needing to make sure that they don't act like they're the higher power that the people who have problems need. He has many New York Irish stories about the people who get addicted to things and the people who search out problems to solve them. And I mean, I can only think too well of plenty of Okies good old Okie evangelical women who search out problem men to fix. And Zmirak says this is exactly not the way you fix greed. The way you show yourself to be generous is not to browbeat anyone. To go search out entire groups of people and label them as simply the poor does not respect their human dignity, but it also misses the point about why it is we like the Garden of Eden, but why God gave us scarcity anyway. It seems that scarcity is this very raw material that God has given us to need necessarily to rely, first of all, on His grace, and second of all, on each other. And that being prudent about this is to never lose sight of the fact of where we're going instead of where we've been. Economics that have a nostalgia will always end up being an economics of resentment. Because if we measure how close the Joneses are to what we imagine the Garden of Eden was like, we will always be disappointed with some Jones that has a little bit more of the garden than we do. But if we think about how we've been blessed with resources to provide not just for our survival, but also as the raw material for how we lead each other closer to each other and more towards God. We eliminate greed, but also imprudent prodigality by thinking about the generosity we have in mind is the generosity that God has given us in the beginning and the generosity that awaits for us towards the end. And this generosity will demand that some of us make wealth, and lots of it. It actually demands some people who will be rich and in charge and can marshal many resources. It also means that there will be people that those rich people, by God's command, take care of. That no one is rich for their own sake. That no one has resources for themselves, but directly to help some people in a certain way. And that ultimately Catholics and the idea of subsidiarity, not trying to provide any sort of political thumbs up to any party, but that subsidiarity is always worried to make sure that at the closest level of contact, human beings take care of one another. And that abstractions of wealth or power, so empires are perfectly fine as long as they allow local governance to actually help control and rule the interactions of people on the ground. Wealth works best face to face, just like charity does, just like any other virtue. Greed, to root it out, must be seen as an impossible, imprudent, and malicious misunderstanding of the scale of scarcity and what it's for. And if scarcity was just a giant green flag for the rat race, ready, go, see what you can get, truly this world would be uninhabitable, and our propensities for civic life, and this is what all Aristotle meant when he said that we're political animals, is not like, oh, we love voting, or we love hearing people tell us lies 24/7 on the radio. What he meant was we were made for each other, and that the city, the polis, best exhibits this idea of the community and the communion of peoples. Economics is the science that says yes, since the fall, we do not have the original glory that was God's endless availability for us as human beings. But through scarcity, we have the capacity for God to lead us together into a new city that does not just have, plenty of water or velociraptors eating carrots or whatever, but instead the spiritual good that can never run out. God himself and those who would worship him without satiation and without resentment forever. Thank you, guys.